Everyone knows that the most famous ocean liner ever built sank on her maiden voyage. But what happened to all those hundreds who died in the freezing waters?
When the ships got to the site, they were greeted with hundreds of bodies bobbing around in the ocean.
They took the Titanic victims so people could come and see if they recognized anybody.
For almost a century, one mystery remained unsolved.
We were worried whether or not there would actually be enough bony material to sample.
So who was the child plucked from the sea and buried in a simple grave with no name? I'm Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris. I'm a medical historian and best-selling author with a PhD in the history of science and medicine from Oxford University. I've written about the pioneering days of surgery, about syphilis, plagues, and pandemics, and even books made of human skin. Some might say I'm obsessed with the macabre and with death, but I think the way people die tells us a whole lot about how they lived. I'm going to explore some of history's most famous lives by looking at them through their extremely curious deaths. This is my investigation room, and here is my science lab where Dr. Rachel Burks will be doing tests and experiments for me. And here is where my crime-solving partner, former Scotland Yard detective Brian Hook, helps me piece together my investigations. Call it biography with a twist, a biography from the morgue. The Titanic, over 1,500 deaths. Most of them not curious, but one is. This episode is a bit different. It's about kind of bringing one victim back to life after over a century. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous stories in history. In 1912, almost 2/3 of all the passengers and crew perished in the freezing North Atlantic Ocean. But what I didn't know was that a small child's body is recovered from the Atlantic where the doomed ship goes down. A boy. And when that tiny body is buried, he's buried with no name. I'm not looking for a murderer, a murder weapon, or even a motive. I'm looking to find the identity of a victim. I want to know who the little boy is, where he comes from, and how he dies. So meet the Titanic's unknown child. This dummy body will be a constant reminder to me of my search. What are his secrets? What details did he give away when they recovered him? My chief investigator, Brian Hook, has been examining the ship's manifest in order to help us uncover the little boy's identity.
This is an altogether unpleasant list, really. These are the 59 children that died when the Titanic sank.
That's so sad.
Yes, this is the list we need to be looking at. The 34 boys that died.
So the unknown child is one of these 34 boys. I wonder how we can narrow it down. Even a century later, there's still so much more to discover about this tragic event. Many of us have seen this footage before. For years, most believe that these were passengers on board the Titanic being waved off from Southampton, England. Except this isn't the Titanic. This is actually her sister ship, the Olympic, as she set sail from New York in the year before Titanic was even launched. These are, in fact, the only known moving pictures of the most famous ship in maritime history. Docked in Belfast, the Titanic prepares for its journey. It makes me want to find out if anything else has been overlooked, even on a case as well known as that of the Titanic. Countless films, TV programs, and books have recounted the story. Las Vegas, Nevada is over 2,500 miles from the chilly North Atlantic, but even it has a direct connection. One of the largest exhibitions of Titanic artifacts in the world. Here, we can get an insight into the lives of over 2,200 passengers and crew, our unknown child among them as they set sail.
We've got three classes. The first class are probably the celebrities of the day, the wealthy, the super rich, who have the most luxurious rooms. Then you have people in the middle, those second class, maybe starting a new life, maybe doing business as well. But you also have a lot of third class, the people at the very bottom who are perhaps putting their life savings into these tickets and chancing their arm to start afresh. But there were over 700 third class passengers along the Titanic.
As the ship sails towards New York, our unknown child is on board somewhere, perhaps sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that lies ahead.
It's a still night. It's described as the sea being almost like a mill pond. She was going pretty quickly, 22 knots. It's dark, there's no moon in the sky, making it harder for the lookouts to spot the icebergs. Binoculars being left locked away, not accessible to those lookouts. And when you put all of those things together, you do see factors that can be having the effect of her sinking.
Brian, it's nearing midnight on April 14th. Now, tell me where the ship had gotten to at this point.
The ship was on a journey from Southampton to New York. That's a distance of 3,419 miles. And it was about 2/3 of the way when they hit the iceberg. The ice tore a huge gash in the starboard side of the hull. And what you now have is over 11 tons of freezing Atlantic seawater flooding into the hull every single second. It took just 2 hours and 40 minutes for the unsinkable Titanic to slip below the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean.
The ship sends out a desperate distress call. There are several vessels close enough to respond. One of the closest is the RMS Carpathia. But it still has to travel an estimated 60 miles to come to the Titanic's aid. Even if more rescue ships had set off from the nearest port of Halifax, they would have still taken 3 to 4 days to reach the wreckage. When the Carpathia finally arrives, the Titanic has disappeared. The day after the sinking of the Titanic, newspapers around the world reported that all the passengers aboard had been saved, with headlines like, "Titanic sinking, no lives lost," and "all saved from the Titanic." How could so many newspapers get it so wrong? The state-of-the-art wireless telegraph transmitter installed by Marconi, the leading technology company, was the Titanic's sole connection to the rest of the world. Other ships in the vicinity had similar transmitters. It turns out that the frantic messages that burst forth in the early hours of April 15, 1912 were chaotic. During the course of wireless chatter, someone asked, "Are the passengers safe?" An answer came, "The ship is being towed to Halifax and everyone is okay." The only problem was that neither the question nor the response were about the Titanic and her passengers. It referred to another ship in the vicinity that had also floundered and was being towed to Halifax. When reporters got wind of the story, misinformation spread like wildfire. The scale of the disaster overshadowed any scandal that may have arisen from this appalling misreporting. And so, the whole saga was simply forgotten.
One of the things that is absolutely true about the Titanic is she only had enough lifeboats for half of the people on board, which is a tragic statistic. So even if all of the lifeboats were filled, it would only have accounted for about 1,200 people or so. There were over 2,200 people on the Titanic.
Most of us have heard about the rescue of those who survived the disaster, floating for hours huddled in their lifeboats in the freezing open Atlantic. What most people don't know is about the mission to recover the bodies of those who died. It was from the Halifax dockside that the recovery cable ship, the Mackay Bennett, sets off. On this voyage, they aren't looking for survivors, and they're carrying a grim cargo. 100 coffins, 100 tons of ice, embalming fluid, and 12 tons of iron bars to bury bodies at sea if they haven't the means to bring them back to shore. This is the morgue ship. And even I, who know a lot about death, finds this spine-chilling. Tracy Oost is a forensic scientist who has taken a special interest in those who died aboard the Titanic.
I don't think the crew was really expecting to find bodies, or at least not very many bodies. They figured that by the time they got to where the Titanic sank, that the currents would have drifted a lot of the bodies away, a lot of the bodies would have sank. But when the ships got to the site, they were greeted with hundreds of bodies bobbing around in the ocean.
April 21st, began picking up bodies. 2 icebergs, the nearest one higher than the other. Sometimes not easily seen, they look like breaking waves. The ocean is strewn with a litter of woodwork, chairs, and bodies.
The crew were given very specific instructions to number the bodies. There was extensive documentation in a log as to the description of the body, the condition that it was in, the personal effects that were found with it. The 4th body that was recovered was the unknown child. The boy was actually face up and frozen. So this would have been, I'm sure, rather disturbing to the crew at the time.
What can we learn about this little boy once he is pulled from the freezing water of the North Atlantic? We have just one clue, a note like this that was later pinned to his body. Number 4, male, estimated age 2, hair fair, clothing, gray coat with fur on collar, brown shoes and stockings. No marks whatsoever, probably 3rd class. It's an extraordinary note, isn't it? But it does allow us to narrow down the search for the boy's identity. Remember, there are 34 boys on our list. How many of them are around 2 years old?
Well, I've been doing some counting, and I found that there were only 6 boys aged 2.5 were under that died on the Titanic. This is the first one, Gösta Poulsen. And then we have Eugene Rice, Sidney Goodwin.
Isn't it amazing that we have photos of all of these babies and children?
Eno Panula. And after all those wonderful ones, one not so good.
Oh, wow.
Albert Peacock. And lastly, Gilbert Danbom.
Such a great French name. Again, really underlining the fact that this was such an international group of passengers. There is one thing we can now be certain of. One of these little boys is our unknown child. After the Titanic sinks, a note pinned to an unidentified child's body reveals he was a 3rd-class passenger. So where would our child have been on the ship? As I understand it, the Titanic hits the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. That means that a lot of people would have been sleeping in their cabins. Where exactly are the 3rd-class cabins?
They are right down in the depths of the hull of the ship. They are the lowest passenger decks. And because of this, the 3rd-class cabins will be most in danger. The flooding was going to reach those people first. And this is a breakdown by the class they were travelling in of who died.
All right, what does it show us?
Well, I find it quite shocking. 62% of 1st-class passengers survived. 2nd-class passengers, 42%. 3rd-class passengers, only 26% survived.
26%?
Yeah.
That's really shocking.
It is. There were 144 women in 1st class. Only 4 died.
Only 4 of the 1st-class women died.
Yeah.
So that tells me if the unknown child was traveling 1st class, he was most likely to survive.
Yes, I agree.
Imagine the boy's mother on that fateful night. It's just before midnight. She's waking up her little boy. The terror. And maybe she's been separated from her older children. She's trying to regroup her family.
Panic sets in. Many 3rd-class passengers who perhaps don't speak English, not knowing exactly what's going on. The testimonies of people that were there, they talk of chaos. The running around and trying to get onto lifeboats, of families who are separated. the screams of people in the water afterwards. It would have been harrowing and terrifying in equal measure.
The eyewitness reports give a chilling sense of what it was like as the ship sank that night.
There fell on the ear the most appalling noise that human beings ever listened to. Cries of hundreds of our fellow beings struggling in the icy cold water, crying for help, with a cry we knew could not be answered. We tried to sing to keep the women from hearing the cries. Those sounds will be one of the things the rescued will find it difficult to efface from memory.
It was said that on the night the Titanic sank, the water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below freezing. How long would someone who didn't die from shock last in those kinds of temperatures?
Experiments have been done on this. What happens to a body in water when you lower and lower the temperature? At first, the body tries to generate heat by shivering. At around 95 degrees, the heart rate, the breathing, and blood pressure all start to increase. But as the temperature drops further, the body tries to compensate by lowering the heart rate, the breathing, and the blood pressure. This cooling, if not checked, leads to disorientation, unconsciousness, and death.
Wow, so how long would that have taken?
Sadly, not very long. It takes about 15 minutes for hypothermia to set in an adult. You could be dead in about 30 minutes. For a child, it would be much shorter.
Amongst the mayhem in Titanic's last moments, the ship's chief baker, Charles Jockin, was a complete outlier. After sending up his finest bread to the parting lifeboats, the experienced seaman, probably realizing he was in mortal danger, gulped down almost half a pint of liqueur. Apparently, he was the very last person to abandon the Titanic. Well-oiled, so to speak, he dropped from an outside rail and into the water just as the ship sank. Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, recalled the freezing conditions, saying, "Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body." Many died from the cold water shock, unable to catch their breath. Flying in the face of medical science, Jockin allegedly lasted for 2.5 hours before being hauled aboard a lifeboat. He continued to work on the transatlantic ships and was also on board the SS Oregon when it sank in Boston Harbor. He served on World War II troop transports, retired in 1944, and died at the age of 78 from natural causes. The survival of the drunk baker goes far beyond the curious and into the miraculous.
There are so many stories of heroism, and one of them is of the small band of musicians who continue playing as the ship sinks. They carry on playing the kind of popular music at the time, take people's minds off what's happening. If there's music playing, well, things must be okay. And at the end, of course, that they realised time's up. So they were together in death as they had been in life.
Tracy Oost has examined what happened to those who didn't hold out long enough to be rescued.
When someone dies in warm water, the body starts to decompose and actually starts to disarticulate. In the case of the Titanic, because it was so cold, the decomposition process would have been greatly delayed. So they were found in a very intact state by the crew of the Mackie Bennett. Facial hair, eyelashes, eyebrows would have had frost on them. The unknown child would not have been wearing a life vest. They wouldn't have had life vests for children at that time. He was wearing layers of clothing that probably captured some air in the process. And children have more fat than adults do, who have more muscle usually, which would have also helped keep him afloat despite not having a life jacket. And then the fact that he was frozen, that kept most of the bodies afloat as well. Eventually, they would recover 328 bodies, a lot more than what they expected. They realized very quickly that they weren't going to have enough embalming fluid, they didn't have enough coffins with them, and so some decisions had to be made about what they were going to do with the bodies. The majority of the bodies that were brought back to Halifax were first-class passengers or people who could have been very easily identified. Bodies that were very badly damaged, if they couldn't be identified, and any third-class passengers or even second-class passengers, the decision was made to bury them at sea.
The funeral service is conducted by Reverend Canon Hind. For nearly an hour, the words, "We therefore commit this body to the deep," are repeated, and at each interval comes splash as the weighted body plunges into the sea, there to sink to a depth of about 2 miles. Splash, splash, splash.
So Brian, I understand that a lot of the bodies of third-class passengers that were recovered were then reburied in the sea.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that we're treating the third-class passengers like that at all.
Really sad. And we know that the unknown child is recovered from the water around this time, and we also know that he was a third-class passenger because of that label. So why didn't they commit him to a watery grave?
Well, the story goes that the sailors just didn't have the heart to bury the little boy at sea, so they brought him back, and they were willing to pay for the funeral themselves.
Well, that's an amazing story. And so he takes his final journey then to Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
There were 209 bodies brought here to Halifax. The gravestones here are laid out in the shape of the bow of a ship to represent the bow of the Titanic. So it's very symbolic that the graves were laid out this way. The unknown child is actually at the top of the gravesite, about halfway up a hill in the cemetery. The crew of the Mackie Bennett felt so bad about this little guy that they had pulled out of the ocean, and that there was no family to claim him, that they paid for a painted white casket with the usual adornments that you would see on a casket, and they had flowers and so on.
It's such a touching story. This tiny fellow melts the hearts of the whole of Halifax, and there he lies for 86 years. Until 1998, when the Paulson family from Sweden makes an astonishing claim. They believe they're the descendants of our unknown child. Can forensic techniques finally make it possible to verify the boy's identity? A young boy's body of around 2 years of age is pulled from the water in the aftermath of the sinking of the Titanic. He is buried in a grave in Halifax, Nova Scotia. There he remains, referred to only as the unknown child. But in 1998, a scientific team set out to solve the mystery of the boy's identity. Forensic genealogist Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris is asked to contribute her expertise.
Well, the project started in the late 90s. The Canadian government had been contacted by the Paulson family from Sweden, who believed the unknown child was a member of their family. There was circumstantial evidence supporting that. There was eyewitnesses accounts of Alma Paulson, the mother, going into the water with the kids, and her body was found with the tickets in her pocket. So, you know, we knew the Paulson children were probably with her, and they took a kind of guess, and they thought it was their relative, Gosta Paulson.
Do we know anything about this boy, Gosta?
Gosta is a good match for our potential victim because he's the right age and he's got blonde hair.
So he could be the unknown child.
Yes, he could. Of course, one of the things we can do today, they couldn't do in those days, was use DNA to identify the victims. But that's what the Paulson family wanted to do. So they had to go to the authorities to get permission to exhume the body so the DNA test could be done.
You have to realize Halifax is a lot of rain. In recent times, a lot of acid rain. So the expectation was very low that there'd be anything left.
After so many years in sodden earth, will anything remain of the unknown child? Especially when you consider how fast a body decomposes under normal conditions. What happens to our bodies after we die? If we're not floating in the ice-cold Atlantic like our Titanic child, we begin decomposing immediately. Bacteria convert the liquids and solids inside of our bodies into gases that cause our corpses to bloat. Just a few days after death, our bodies can swell to almost twice their previous size. At this stage, the bacterial production of sulfur gives our bodies a strange yellowish color referred to by pathologists as marbling. It's around this time that flies begin to arrive. Their eggs later hatch into maggots, which devour the flesh. In around 6 months, depending on temperature and humidity, all that's left is skin and bone. We still have a huge amount to learn about how the body decays, but now we have a new tool to help scientists. The first body farm was set up by anthropologist William M. Bass in 1981 at the University of Tennessee. Here, at any one time, up to 50 rotting cadavers are left to decompose so that they can be studied. As gruesome as it sounds, forensic scientists and anthropologists use their research to help investigate homicides and even genocides, solving the important questions of how, when, and where a person died. In Halifax, on May 18, 2001, forensic anthropologist Tracy Oost and her team begin the exhumation.
Exhumation is a very delicate operation. One of the things that was paramount for us was making sure that this was done in a forensic manner and that we would have as much dignity as possible involved with this case. We very quickly realized that there was a lot of groundwater here, and that was going to hamper our process. We were a little bit worried about the preservation of the unknown child and whether or not there would actually be enough bony material to sample. However, we were able to find about a 6-centimeter long piece of bone that we wouldn't have found at all, except for the fact that one of the adornments from the casket, this medallion that appeared to say "Our Babe" and had a certain amount of copper in it, had actually fallen down on top of the body as the casket collapsed and disintegrated. Copper actually preserves bone. So where the other bone in the area had long since disintegrated, that particular piece of bone was preserved by that medallion.
It's 2002, and after lying in his grave for 89 years, the unknown child is about to get a name. If the tiny amount of bone yields enough of the right kind of DNA, then we can find out if it matches with the Paulson family, who believe they are the child's descendants. Historian Alan Ruffman was a key part of the investigating team in Nova Scotia.
Pieces of the bone were sent out to various DNA laboratories, and the metal may have assisted the bone to be preserved, but it also made for contamination. That gave people an awfully difficult time. It was not an ideal sample.
But it is enough to begin testing for a crucial inherited link down the female family line.
Mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mother to child. So if we take a look at a cell, the nucleus is right in the center, and that's where the DNA is. Now, surrounding that, hundreds of them, if not thousands, is the mitochondria, which have their own DNA. All the children from the same mother should have the same mitochondrial DNA. Now, how they do an actual mitochondrial DNA test is they start by looking at a hypervariable region of mitochondrial DNA nicknamed HVR1 to see who can be excluded. If you don't match at HVR1, you are definitely not maternally related.
And mitochondria are thought to have been independent bacteria millions of years ago that invaded primitive cells, and normally the cell would kill it or digest it, but that didn't happen. So the mitochondria took up residence and they got food and water from the cell, and at the same time they provided the cell with energy to stay alive and for metabolism. So it formed a symbiotic relationship that was good for both parties. So those bacteria replicated. Now every cell in your body has up to maybe 1,000 with their own private mitochondria genome.
When they looked at the DNA, unfortunately, Gustav Leonard Paulsen was eliminated quite quickly in the summer after the initial exhumation. The DNA wasn't a match. So we knew it was one of the other 5 at that point.
Wow, that must have been really disappointing for the Paulsen family. Who do we have left?
Well, Gustav Paulsen, he's eliminated. That leaves us with 5. We have Eugene Rice, he's 2.5 years old. Sidney Goodwin, he's 19 months old. Got Eno Panula, he's 13 months old. Albert Peacock, he's just 7 months old. And lastly, we have Gilbert Danbom, and he's only 5 months old.
5 months, so young. Meanwhile, the investigators had undertaken the exhausting task of tracing female descendants for the remaining 5 boys. If they couldn't find any, the search for the unknown child would end.
You have to consider in doing this work that these families were wiped out. But you have to find, a family reference. And a lot of times that involves going back in time, building the tree up and then work down to the present until you can find a living family member along the female line. So that can be 1, 2, 3, 4 generations. It depends on the family.
But through extraordinary dedication, the team managed to track down relatives in all 5 families. It turns out that in the 2 youngest candidates, Albert Peacock and Gilbert Danbom, and the eldest, Eugene Rice, the mitochondrial DNA also did not match. They are ruled out.
There were 2 left. One was a Finnish baby, Eno Panula, and the other one was Sidney Leslie Goodwin, an English baby. He was 19 months old, Eno was like 13 months old, but both of them were identical on HVR1.
What are the odds of 2 Titanic infants from different countries matching in their initial DNA test? Well, actually, it turns out pretty good.
The use of mitochondrial DNA was really quite young, and the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation had begun to assemble a database of mitochondrial DNA. And they had realized that if you're in the northern part of Scandinavia or England, and you're a white Caucasian, you have roughly about 18% that in hypervariable area 1, there'll be a match with someone else. So it's quite common. And that HV1 was not going to be conclusive.
This is getting really exciting now. Just going over what we know. We've narrowed down the search from 59 children down to 34 boys, and then just 6 boys aged 2.5 years or under. Out of those 6, 4 boys didn't match the DNA. That leaves us with 2. 2 babies that it could be with a common female ancestor. Sidney Goodwin and Eno Panula. One of these 2 boys is the unknown child. And so, in this twisting and turning scientific search, attention turned to other remains on Earth from deep inside the grave.
After finding the bone, we kept excavating, and I was able to actually find 3 small teeth, 2 molars and another tooth. It was definitely exciting. Finding the teeth was a bit of a eureka moment.
Are these fragments of teeth the vital clue that may finally put a name to the Titanic's unknown child? Sidney Goodwin and Eno Panula. Both are a match on their DNA tests, and both come from poor families escaping Europe for a fresh start in the New World. Their stories are eerily similar. Finnish-born Maria Panula boards the Titanic at Southampton with her 5 children. Her husband is already in America. The passenger lists show that Maria and her 3 younger sons have a cabin in the stern. An eyewitness reveals that soon after the ship starts sinking, one of the older boys runs from their cabin in the bow to wake them all up. But in the confusion, Maria loses some of her boys. None of the families survived, and none of the bodies were ever found. Unless, of course, the unknown child is Eno, Maria's youngest child. Augusta and Frederick Goodwin are also traveling on the Titanic with their 6 children. Like the Panula family, Frederick is taking them to a new life in the US. Relatives in America have lent the family money for their tickets, 46 pounds and 18 shillings, a huge sum for a poor family. And they found and furnished a house for the whole family ready for their arrival on American soil. They all perish in the wreck of the Titanic. Is the unknown child the youngest member of the Goodwin family, 19-month-old Sydney? But how to distinguish between Sydney and Eno, two children who couldn't be separated by their DNA? The key is the teeth, estimated to be from a child under 15 months.
They brought pediatric dentists and orthodontists into the picture, and based on the lack of wear on the teeth, the growth of the roots, they ruled that the child was probably the younger child, Enopanula, and that's it. A big celebration worldwide.
The identity of the unknown child was triumphantly announced on November 6, 2002.
The results on both dental and DNA analysis are consistent with the remains being those of Enopanula.
This relative from Helsinki found out 11 days ago that scientists had made a genetic match, and with her family she came to Halifax to visit the gravesite.
I'm crying because I couldn't think that it's possible.
The remains identified as those of Enopanula, the child of this woman's great aunt.
A 90-year-old mystery has been solved. Or has it? Shortly after the announcement, a new piece of evidence is found which dates back to just a few days after the ship sank, and it changes everything. A small pair of brown children's shoes. Nothing is straightforward in this investigation. These shoes turn up and bring their own story with them. Just winding back, this is what happens to the bodies when the death ship, the Mackay Bennett, returns to shore. A Halifax police sergeant, Clarence Northover, does something that he actually shouldn't do.
The story was that they took the Titanic victims so people could come and see if they recognized anybody. There was a police guard that was guarding the bodies. They didn't want souvenir hunters. And when time came to burn the clothes, that guard saved the shoes. He couldn't bear to see them burned. So he took them, he put them in his desk drawer at the police station, and he kept them, and then he passed them to his son and his grandson, who eventually gave them to the museum.
This is incredible. At the 11th hour, a brand new piece of evidence comes in. A pair of brown shoes hidden away in a drawer in a local police station are passed down 2 generations before being donated to the Maritime Museum in Halifax by the police guard's descendants. They claim they belong to the unknown child.
The museum went through a long process of verifying the provenance. The fact that the name is misspelled tells me that if this was a deliberate hoax, you probably would have got the spelling of the word Titanic right. As it is, it has an extra T in it. The line of persons from Halifax at the time of the bodies coming ashore through to the shoes being brought to the museum is pretty solid. They very clearly have been in water. So I'm comfortable that they really are the shoes of the unknown child.
This museum analyzed the amount of salt in the shoes to see if it was commensurate with the salt in the ocean. They looked for diatoms in the shoes, like those little one-cell animals in the ocean. They put that all together and they said, it's reasonable to believe that these are the shoes of the unknown child.
Remember the note pinned to the child? It gives a clear description of what he's wearing, most crucially the brown shoes. I'm confident that the shoes from the police station drawer belong to the unknown child, but the museum's experts believe they're not the size of shoes for a 13-month-old baby, that they're too big. After almost a century, is there yet another dramatic twist in the mystery of the unknown child? The unknown unknown child, one of the most mysterious casualties of the sinking of the Titanic, had in 2002 been officially named as Finnish-born Eno Panula. But in an extraordinary turn of events, this identification might be overturned by a new piece of evidence: a pair of brown shoes.
The trouble started when somebody realized that the shoes were too big for a 13-month-old Finnish baby, Eno Panula. And as far as the style, were consistent with shoes commercially available in the UK at that time.
Everything they thought about the identity of the unknown child is now thrown into doubt. In 2002, DNA testing wasn't sophisticated enough to set Sydney and Eno apart. But by 2007, testing could go deeper and reveal characteristics unique to each of their families. The trouble is that the research group hang up their test tubes after the teeth look like they match Eno. Now, new DNA tests are needed, and these are done by AFDL, the Armed Forces Identification Laboratory, which specializes in DNA sequencing.
And they look at another part of mitochondrial DNA called HVR2. They find a match for Sydney's family, but not Eno's.
Okay, so a tick for Sydney.
Yes, but they want to be really sure, so they have to go even deeper into the DNA, which happens with DNA analysis when you want to actually exclude someone. They end up finding a mutation in Sydney's family and not in Eno's. Combining the results from AFDL and what we know about those English brown shoes, you get only one child.
Now I can reveal once and for all the unknown child. Sydney Leslie Goodwin, age 19 months, a baby with a fur collar on his jacket and a pair of little brown shoes, and his own unique DNA.
What little amount of DNA was extracted was exhausted through these rounds of testing. I was told the identification was made based on the DNA in one cell of that child's body, and now it's gone. It was a miracle, so you always have to be happy about a miracle. And a miracle like this, isn't it wonderful? We solved it. We know who the unknown child is now. That's great. That's a good day.
But there's one final tragic twist connected to the Goodwins that began before they even set sail. The Goodwin family were never even meant to be aboard the Titanic. They had tickets for the SS New York, but at the last minute, they were transferred to the Titanic.
The spring of 1912 was an interesting time. There was a coal strike in Wales, which had the knock-on effect that there wasn't the coal to go around for all the liners. Those ships no longer leave, and passengers are moved. So we have a number of families, including the Goodwin family. They get the good news as they see it. They're going to be on the most beautiful, the newest ship that the world has ever seen.
It's so sad. We know that the Goodwin family, all 8 of them, were on the Titanic, but there were only 4 beds in that cabin. Would they have been together?
Highly likely they'd have been separated by gender. Father would have been with the boys in the bow, and mother would have been with the daughters, and Sydney in the stern.
It's so tragic. The family wouldn't have been together when the ship hit the iceberg.
What is a bit unusual about 1912 is that it was a particularly cold winter. And so the icebergs are around longer than usual. And so by April, there are icebergs further south than there might normally have been. And so this is another possible reason why they're not expecting to find an iceberg where they are. They think they're too far south, but unfortunately they're not.
What's interesting is that the ship contacted the iceberg, a little spur under the water. Wasn't a big like collision, a little spur, and the ship and the iceberg were in contact for 7 seconds. And the rest is history.
On August 6, 2008, the living descendants within the Goodwin family finally visit the grave to pay their respects to baby Sydney. Carol Goodwin, his second cousin, reads the names of the other children who also perished when the Titanic went down, and a bell is rung for each.
The Goodwin family had a memorial. The family had been drawn together because of this. It sort of cemented their place in history, which is always good, and made closure for their family. They decided to leave the stone as it was for all the children that died, to preserve that for everyone and not just keep it for themselves. I think that was a good thing.
Science is one of the most powerful tools for uncovering the past, but none of this would have ever been solved had it not been for the ordinary people who ended up playing an extraordinary part in this entire story. Let's hear it for the men who wrote those heartbreaking diaries, the people of Halifax, and the scientists who launched this project to find out the identity of the unknown child. But overall, let's hear it for the people who hold on to little fragments of the past. You're the foot soldiers of history, and I'm your biggest fan.